Great. So good evening and welcome everyone to Science on Tap. I'm Mike Medea, the head of education programs at the American Philosophical Society's Library and Museum, or at the APS, and I'll be your host for tonight's program. I'd like to take a moment to request your participation in maintaining a safe and welcoming space by adhering to our community guidelines, which have been posted in the chat, and I'll post again after this quick intro. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Science on Tap is a free monthly gathering held temporarily on Zoom on the second Monday of the month that features presentations by scientists or other experts, followed by lively conversation. Science on Tap is sponsored by a consortium of 6 Philadelphia institutions: the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University, the American Philosophical Society, or the APS, pause for cheering, the Mutter Museum of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the Penn Museum, the Science History Institute, and the Wagner Free Institute of Science. If you love us, please follow us on Facebook and join our email list, which you can do so on our website, scienceontapphilly.com. And I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker in just a minute, but while I have you captive, I do want to give a quick heads up that this will be the last Science on Tap until the fall. With all of our organizations beginning to reopen, we all also want to live that hot vax summer. So we're going to take a quick break until the fall while we readjust and kind of enjoy a brief hiatus after giving a good run of virtual programs. So quick housekeeping note as well, is that again, you will notice that the chat is mostly disabled. You can message the panelists if you would like to, but we're going to be using the Q&A feature for this evening mostly. So throw your questions and other kind of comments in there throughout the evening. We have also enabled live transcriptions, so if you need to use that or would like to use that, it is the CC button. If you click that, you should be able to see the subtitles. So now on to the reason that we are all here this evening. I am pleased to introduce Deans Velocci. What's page for the bio, which I'm always terrible at remembering from hand. Deans Velocci, just barely still a PhD candidate in history at Yale, where they will be defending their dissertation next Wednesday. Oh God, I didn't know that was that soon, even when I reread it this morning. Their work focuses on sex classification and its many misuses. Deans has written for the Washington Post and Avidly, has pieces forthcoming in Transgender Studies Quarterly, and an edited collection called Feminism Against Cisness. It is currently co-editing a cross-disciplinary special issue of the American Naturalist titled Nature, Data, and Power. This fall, Deans will join the faculty in History and Sociology of Science at Penn, and they welcome your recommendations for Philly's best bike routes and ice cream. So really do message the panelists and attendees for that kind of information throughout the evening. So with that, I will turn it over to Deans, and we'll see if I can work my Zoom magic to transfer pretty swiftly and smoothly.
Cool, so I'm going to make my sharing my screen face. This is my sharing my screen face. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay. Hi. Okay. Thanks everyone for being here. So I've been tasked with being the Science on Tap speaker to celebrate Pride Month, and on many levels that makes a lot of sense, given that both I and my work are very gay, very queer, very trans, etc., etc. Unfortunately, my work is also really depressing. It's mostly about how science repeatedly foreclosed queer possibilities of life through the 19th and 20th centuries, and how even when science, is the sound not working? No, that was related to something else. Okay, sorry, the Q&A just did a sound thing. So even when scientists did engage with the wide variety of life forms that could be used as evidence that sex and sexuality were far more complicated and exciting than a reproductive binary, these scientists use them as evidence of the supposed naturalness of racial hierarchy, or to prop up their own professional scientific expertise. It has been, let me tell you, a real downer to work on over the past several years. But I think that there are some little inklings of possibility in there somewhere for remaking science about queerness into queer science. So I've attempted to give you the most hopeful version of my work that I could muster. And if it's still super depressing, which it most certainly is, I will just say that it wouldn't be Pride Month if it weren't emotionally complicated. So what I'm going to do in my remaining 28 minutes or so is this. First, I'm going to share with you a few of the non-human species that 19th and early 20th century scientists encountered who very much did not fit into a binary arrangement of sex. While doing so, I'm going to talk about the narratives of racial hierarchy and scientific expertise that contributed to those animal examples being used for violence. Then I'm going to discuss some of the more contemporary efforts to locate queerness in nature and why they often don't work towards queer liberation. So while that part is not very cheerful, I'm going to end with some thoughts on what we might think about or how we might think about the relationship between queerness and science differently, which might be moderately uplifting. Happy Pride from me to you. I really did try to make this a happier talk, and we can talk about why that didn't work later on. A quick note on terminology. In this particular context, I'm not that concerned with splitting off gender from sexuality or from sex, in large part because a lot of the sources that I've been working with over the past several years don't make that distinction particularly precisely. And I'm happy to talk more about this approach later. But just know that there is, in fact, a reason why I'm going pretty casually back and forth between queerness as sexual behavior / identity on one hand, and queerness as bodies that complicate a reproductive binary on the other, and why I'm using queer as an umbrella category for both. Okay, let's go back to the past. If you flip through a 19th or early 20th century zoology journal, popular science magazine, or natural history text, you'll more likely than not encounter a description of an animal specimen of weird sexual configuration. Maybe it's an individual butterfly with a male pattern on one wing and a female pattern on the other, or a hen that woke up one morning crowing like a rooster. Maybe it's an entire species of oyster that obviously reproduces somehow, but not using any body parts that anyone is familiar with. The possibilities were basically endless. Most histories of sex argue that despite these many possibilities, sex became increasingly narrowly and precisely defined over time. In the process, the high social stakes of sex determinations, alongside the increasing cultural authority of science, made scientists and doctors the ultimate deciders of what was male and what was female. And at the same time, the animal world became a site for proving that male and female differences were natural law. I argue in my work more broadly and beyond this talk that in contrast to this narrative, that these scientists largely failed to create a coherent binary order. Don't worry about the intro slide. I'm still introing. There will be other slides in a minute. Yeah. I am not a big fan of the PowerPoint, as you will see. So these are more kind of like illustrative images than like super important slides. So while these scientists certainly made much of their ability to sort female bodies from male ones, their choices in doing so reflected much more about their investments in their own expertise and in white supremacy than about the animals they studied. And they made different choices depending on what worked best in a particular situation. Exceptions, uncertainty, and contradiction were much more common than consensus, and sex functioned as a system of sorting bodies because it was so flexible. There were a lot of animals and plants that gave scientists trouble as they were studying sex, and I'm going to tell you about 3 that kept coming up in my research. Hyenas, free martins, which are basically intersex cows, and a group of insects including ants and bees. In different ways, they each opened up possibilities to think about sex as something other than binary. So like I said, my work is not particularly celebratory. For the most part, these possibilities were foreclosed or used to such violent ends that it's hard to make a feel-good story out of them. Scientists constructed non-binary sex as a problem to be solved in order to prove their own expertise. They used links between what they called hermaphroditism and animality to make claims that Black and Indigenous people were less sexually differentiated and therefore less human than white people. and they eventually conducted sex research in the service of eugenics. At the same time, their efforts to do so often unintentionally created tremendous flexibility within definitions of sex categories, and helped show that sex as a system has never really made very much sense at all. So as I talk about these various bits and pieces of animal research, I invite you to hold these two outcomes of the work in tension. On one hand, tremendous violence, on the other, queer possibility. And just to plant a seed for our conversation later, perhaps think about the ethical implications for using arguments about queer nature when this is its history. Okay, now there's going to be a new slide. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, everyone can see the slide, I hope. Okay, so in the late 1870s and 1880s, an anatomist and medical school dean named Morrison Watson published a series of articles on the anatomy of spotted hyenas, in which he explicitly framed the female hyena as sexually mysterious, and then presented his superior scientific methods as the solution to the problem. The colleague who had sent him his first female hyena specimen, Watson reported, did so because he was so baffled as to what sex it was that he wanted a second opinion. What was so mysterious? The, quote, peculiar characteristics of the female hyena included, quote, the absence of any well-marked vulva, the presence of an elongated pendulous penis-like body, and the presence of two projections which at once called to mind the appearance of the scrotum. Watson frequently remarked on how these peculiarities rendered the identification of the sex a matter of difficulty and made it nearly impossible to distinguish between male and female. Nonetheless, Watson insisted he, a well-trained anatomist, could tell the difference. Watson proceeded to try to shoehorn the hyena into a binary framework. He went to great lengths to identify female structures where they were not particularly evident. So for example, Watson determined that what he initially thought to be scrotal tissue was actually just cutaneous elevations, which he referred to parenthetically as labia with a question mark. But throughout his writing, Watson actively described the hyena as not conforming to binary expectations so that he could make it do so. He made his expertise apparent by describing the mastery required to make sense of the hyena's confusingly ambiguous anatomy. Watson and his colleagues also established their own scientism by repeatedly comparing their modern knowledge to what they called absurd indigenous and ancient beliefs that all hyenas were either hermaphroditic or capable of changing their sex. In order for modern science to be the hero of the story, the hyena had to first be established as inspiring hundreds, if not thousands of years of confusion among purportedly less sophisticated people. But Watson also constructed sexual ambiguity. He queered the hyena, if you will. As he tried to describe his specimens within the category female, he emphasized how poorly that classification fit and how slight the distinctions between maleness and femaleness could be. The study of free martins, or what we might now call intersex co-twins of bulls, also played fast and loose with what particular body parts might be designated male or female. The free martin had long been known to cattle breeders and butchers, though it first appeared in scientific literature in John Hunter's 1779 account of the free martin. The free martin quickly became one of scientists' most frequently discussed examples of what they called hermaphroditism, as they tried to figure out what had happened in the free martin's development to end up with a mix of male and female characteristics. Almost all of this work made some kind of claim about the starting point of the free martin's real sex and declared it either a malformed male or a modified female. To make these claims, scientists had to make choices about what counted as male or female. From the beginning, Hunter noted that free martins were more female than not, reporting that his specimens displayed, quote, external parts that had more of the cow than the bull. James Simpson's frequently cited 1847 work on hermaphroditism, which featured a section on the free martin, concurred that the free martins seemed more female than male. But others had different opinions. In 1909, for example, gynecologist D. Barry Hart concluded that free martins were male, quote, except in their genital tract and secondary sexual characters, implying in the process that true maleness could still be found regardless of sexual characteristics. For Hart, free martins were not hermaphrodites at all, merely males with a uterus and a vagina. Hart was joined in this claim by several prominent geneticists who likewise argued that free martins were actually males that resembled females. The free martin question took on an even greater significance in the early 20th century, as evidence that hormonal exposure affects embryonic development of sex characteristics. Frank Lilly, whose work on the free martin served as a foundation for endocrine theories of sex differentiation, argued that the free martin, quote, could not possibly be interpreted as a male, the opposite of the researchers that I just mentioned. Even though the free martin possessed a phallus and gonads that most scientists had identified as testes, Lilly argued it was in fact a female that had been modified in utero by male hormones. The free martin then might be a male with female genitals or a female with male gonads, very trans of them. In studies of the free martin, maleness and femaleness were not self-evident or closely guarded categories. They could shift to contain bodies of all kinds. Over the course of the 19th century, whether bees and ants had a third neuter sex was a source of a lot of disagreement. The neuter worker was, by the end of the century, tentatively and unevenly replaced by an insistence that the worker was an underdeveloped female. As with hyenas and free martins, though, in order to force the worker into a female category, the meanings of male and female had to flex in order to fit their new contexts. One of the ways that this happened was a detachment of femaleness from reproductive capacity. Some scientists turned from the body to behavior for their sorting along these lines. An article in the journal Gleanings in Bee Culture that was part of an extended conversation over multiple issues of the journal about what pronouns to use for worker bees argued that even though workers could not reproduce, they were female because of their role in food preparation and rearing of young. They, quote, keep house, nurse the babies, and hustle around to get something to put on the table. So sex could be conceptualized irrespective of reproduction and irrespective of any bodily configuration. The body itself mattered far less than what it did. So while expert scientists and beekeepers rearranged the meaning of femaleness to make room for workers, vernacular publications like Popular Science Monthly and Scientific American allowed for the possibility that worker ants were a third sex, that these insects' three-sex system made them superior to species who had only two sexes. In the 19th century, hermaphroditism largely represented an undifferentiated state of what people called primitivity or degeneration, with sexual dimorphism, or having two sexes, signaling a more evolved state in a way that was really highly racialized, and I'll come back to this in a moment. But in that model, the existence of three sexes, some writers reasoned, meant that a species had evolved to an even more differentiated state. In light of ants' complicated sex system, an entomology writer for Popular Science Monthly named E.R. Leland wondered in 1875 if man is destined to remain forever the higher animal. The splitting of ants into three rather than two sexes was the result of a social economy with a complex division of labor, which in mankind, Leland noted, always marks a high state of civilization. Another Popular Science article claimed that neuter insects signaled better distribution of resources and greater efficiency because they didn't require as much food to supply reproductive systems. Neuter insects, in fact, were so much better at resource distribution that they would be able to succeed at communism, where humans had thus far been unable to. While these arguments for the advanced sexual trimorphism of bees and ants don't seem to have been taken up by professional scientists, they indicate a popular willingness to think more broadly about the possibilities of sex. So in each of these examples, the study of animal sex produced questions and problems that could not be entirely plastered over. Scientists had to invent ambiguity to prove themselves experts, had to constantly modify their definitions, and perhaps unintentionally opened up room to talk about the advanced nature of non-binary possibilities. Without doubt, though, the scientific study of sex more broadly enabled the pathologization of certain bodies and the normalization of others. As Kyla Schiller has argued, binary sexes emerged in the 19th century as specifically racial categories. According to leading scientists of the day, full sex differentiation could only be achieved by white bodies, and everyone else displayed more similarities between male and female. Take, for example, the words of Patrick Geddes and J. Arthur Thompson, whose 1890 book, The Evolution of Sex, would go on to influence some of the key players in American and European studies of sex and sexuality in the 20th century. Quote, that all higher animals are represented by distinct male and female forms is one of the most patent facts of observation, they wrote. In the lower animals, the contrast and indeed the separateness of the sexes often disappears. Soon after, however, they admitted apparent exceptions occur, it is true, among the higher animals. And for them, this included degrees of sexual dimorphism that they claimed differed among humans according to race. Geddes and Thompson assured their readers that neither exceptional animals nor exceptional lower races, as they framed it, required revising statements about white humans being the best because they were clearly sexually dimorphic. Africans, for example, were just like bees. Drone bees, Geddes and Thompson pointed out, engaged in far less activity than worker bees. So the astute reader might thus use the drone bee to counter the two authors' arguments about male and female difference, because Geddes and Thompson had claimed that males were the most active members of a society, and male drones were remarkably passive. In Geddes and Thompson's view, drones, quote, are no more fair examples of the natural average of males than the hard-driven wives of the lazy African are of the normal functions of women. So they thus make an argument for the less evolved state, so-called, of non-white humans without threatening the sexual dimorphism of whiteness by linking hermaphroditism to animality at the site of race. So the takeaway here is that the queer possibility of all of these studies of animal sex beyond a binary cannot be separated, as scholars like Kyla Schiller, Riley Snorton, Kaji Amin, Jules Gill Peterson, and many others, myself included, have argued from white supremacist science. The two go together. I'm sorry to say that there are also other problems for the queer possibilities of animal science. Once again, happy Pride. So I'm going to jump now into a more contemporary frame. There have been a lot of efforts to use arguments about nature to legitimize queerness. And there are many, many variations on this, but you're probably familiar with the general vibe of people pointing to animals that engage in same-sex sexual behavior or queer-looking family formation, or that change sexual characteristics over the course of their lives, and saying, hey, look, it's not just queer humans who do this. Queerness is not some unnatural aberration. There is a great diversity of life, and we would all be better off if we could recognize that. And it's quite pervasive as a narrative, both among certain scientists and in popular culture. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of that before, again, ruining it. On the science end of things, Bruce Bagamil and Joan Roughgarden are two of the most well-known voices on this topic. Both of them are queer themselves. Bagamil is a cis gay man, Roughgarden is a trans woman, and both use their scientific expertise to show how widespread queerness is in non-human animals and how dominant scientific theories have ignored that and instead reinforced the idea that heterosexuality and what in the years after these books were published we would now call cisness are natural. So both of them say in some way or another that they're not directly arguing that just because something can be found in nature, it's a moral or desirable thing. And yet that's basically the takeaway. So in his 1999 book, Biological Exuberance, Bagamil points out that same-sex sexual behavior, courting, affection, pair bonding, and parenting are extremely common in nature and have been observed in hundreds of species. So this is basically a way of saying, don't worry, it's not that weird for people either. Roughgarden argues in Evolution's Rainbow, first out in 2004, reissued in a 10th anniversary edition in 2014, that same-sex sex fosters social relations that aid in collective survival. Roughgarden is clear in her writing that she wants to argue for greater acceptance of queer and trans people as part of natural diversity. And not just natural diversity for its own sake, but evolutionarily advantageous diversity. It's good for the species that there are queer people, or queer animals, as it were. So regardless of the author's intent, also this kind of work has been used to make explicitly political arguments. So perhaps most tellingly, biological exuberance was cited in an amicus brief in the 2003 Supreme Court case Lawrence v. Texas, which struck down the last remaining sodomy laws in the United States. And there's also a similar implied argument about queer animals in popular contexts. So penguins have probably received the most press for their queerness, starting in the early 2000s with the revelation that a pair-bonded set of penguins at the New York Aquarium were both male, according to a blood test, and I will gloss over the problems with determining true sex via blood test. The penguins, which are named Wendell and Cass, had for several years engaged in courtship, nesting, and copulation exclusively with each other. You can get a sense of the implied politics of the coverage of their relationship in a Salon headline from 2002, "We're here, we're queer, we're penguins," an allusion to the Queer Nation slogan, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." A few years later, gay penguins got some more attention when a zookeeper at the Central Park Zoo gave a fertilized egg to Roy and Silo, another male penguin couple, who had been caring for a rock together in their shared nest. Roy and Silo's story became the focus of the 2005 illustrated children's book, And Tango Makes Three, Tango being the name of the chick who hatched from the aforementioned egg. In addition to being frequently banned from school libraries, And Tango Makes Three has been lauded for, quote, introducing family diversity to children. More recently, in 2019, the London Zoo put up a banner reading, "Some penguins are gay, get over it," in its penguin exhibit, which is home to gay penguin couple Ronnie and Reggie. So again, these gay penguin narratives implicitly point to the naturalness of queerness to make claims about what it's okay for humans to do. They justify queerness with an appeal to nature. And this narrative comes through in far more casual ways as well, repeating this link between human queerness and nature, even when not at all making claims about politics or morality. So take, for example, a quiz recently posted on the lesbian culture website Autostraddle, where you can find out which animal with queer tendencies you are. So penguins, of course, are one of the options. It turns out that I am a snail, and as the description of snail energy notes, most snail species have two different types of sex organs, making them the gender fluid friends of the animal kingdom. This quiz is not a particularly serious assertion of anything. Questions include things like, what is your most used emoji, and what's the most important thing on your nightstand? But the quiz is nonetheless a reminder that there are queer animals, we are just like them, with the veneer of scientific truth. Ties between queerness and nature are not only about animals. And here's really where things start to get dicey. So sometimes the biological basis of queerness in humans comes under study. People have been trying to locate a gay gene for quite some time, at least since the late 1990s, and they are still at it. A massive 2019 study using genomic data from 500,000 people once again failed to find this supposed gay gene, although it seems like the researchers remain interested in trying. A summary of the study in the journal Nature pointed to a need for more data rather than a reconfiguration of the research question in the next attempt to locate the genetic basis of queer behavior. A 2018 study from several Belgian and Dutch researchers claimed to find that, quote, transgender brains are more like the desired gender from an early age. The lead author said that she hoped that this would help improve future diagnosis and therapy for trans teens. There are several assumptions, of course, built in here. One, transness is literally written on the body and can be read by an MRI scanner. Two, there are inherently different male and female brains. And three, the secret to happier trans teens is figuring out who is really trans with science rather than listening to trans teens themselves. There is a long, long history of political arguments that queer people are queer for some inherent biological reason, both within and outside of science. From mid-19th century sexology that tried to fight the criminalization of sodomy by arguing that queer people could not possibly be blamed for their sexual desires, to the 2011 Pride anthem, Lady Gaga's Born This Way. For some, this is a source of great comfort, of political utility, of making oneself legible and legitimate. I am uncomfortable with this kind of appeal to science. Some of it is the assumptions that I just mentioned, as well as an overall discomfort with classification systems that presuppose that everyone fits neatly into discrete categories, another thing that I am very happy to talk about. Some of this is the white supremacist history of sex science. There's also another problem. So Eve Sedgwick cautioned in the early 1990s in a foundational article called How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay that efforts to determine why people are queer often go hand in hand with a desire to make us not be that way. The title comes from Sedgwick's realization that there were countless therapeutic approaches to sex and gender nonconformity in children, but there were no guides to encouraging a child to turn out queer. So the question for me regarding any biomedical research into gender and sexuality, human or animal, is what will be done with that knowledge? So let's say, just for the sake of the thought experiment, that there is a gay gene or a trans gene. What happens with that information? Maybe in the future in which that discovery is made, someone uses CRISPR or the techno-future outgrowth of it to produce more queerness. Great, that's pretty cool, I guess. But in a world in which state legislatures are currently actively making life harder for trans kids, I don't have a lot of faith that it would go this way. So where does that leave us? If science about queerness is so fraught with the possibility of misuse, and historically has often been used against queer people to support white supremacy and for the benefit of scientists themselves, is there a way out? Something I've been thinking a lot about has been the question of whether science itself can be queer. And if so, what would a queer science look like? One possibility is rethinking the tendency to explain queerness as a confusing oddity. This was clarified for me by an article that some of my scientist colleagues wrote in 2019, an alternative hypothesis for the evolution of same-sex sexual behavior in animals. And I believe some of them might be here and could help me talk about this. So the authors point out that efforts to solve the mystery of persistent queerness across species assumes that life started out with sex as purely heterosexual and reproductive, and anything else is a kind of weird aberration that doesn't make sense within an evolutionary framework. But these authors propose that maybe all sex was at some point indiscriminate, with efforts to identify and reproduce with a specific kind of body coming much later. So queerness hasn't had to develop multiple times against the reproductive dictates of evolution, and it in fact doesn't have to be justified at all. Instead of asking why queerness, these authors ask, why not? There are other things beyond the content of the research itself that might open up possibilities for a shift from science about queerness to queer science. My thinking about this shift came out of the undergraduate seminar that I taught this past semester called, surprise, Queer Science, where I and my students and my illustrious co-instructor, Joanna Radin, came together each week to think about possibilities for doing science differently. We certainly talked about research on gender and sexuality, but our conversations quickly turned to science itself and what students were being taught in STEM classes. And it turns out that they were being taught things like a pandemic should not be interrupting their productivity because the conditions of the world have nothing to do with lab science. Their feelings don't matter. University structures were not to be questioned or changed. Their experiences as queer and trans people should not inform their science because to be queer and trans is to not be objective. Over the course of the semester, our strategies for conducting science otherwise repeatedly cohered around things like taking emotions seriously, especially when something doesn't feel right, considering why people want to know certain things and the price of knowing them, reassessing the narrative that if we simply have the correct information, things will get better. And especially, perhaps queerest of all, questioning the idea that knowledge is pinning something down, classifying it, and declaring mastery. And these things get at the heart of what it means to produce scientific knowledge. We also asked, what if instead of appealing to the cultural authority of science and nature to make arguments for queer and trans legitimacy, we refuse demands for evidence that we should get to exist? What if science took the insights of queer and trans studies as seriously as we're supposed to take biology? What if queer and trans people stop trying to out-science those who aren't going to be convinced anyway, and move on to conversations more interesting than what we biologically are, like how to secure healthcare and housing for queer and trans people, or whatever else we haven't even gotten an opportunity to think about because we're so busy trying to prove that we're real in the eyes of science. So I am ultimately far better at locating problems than solving them. So I don't have incredibly concrete answers to these questions. I'm honestly not sure if the life sciences can be repurposed for queer survival. Doing so would require a lot of reconfiguring what science is and how it's done. But I know from my conversations with students and my conversations with scientist colleagues that there's a hunger within the sciences for something different than what there is right now. And I know from my own work that there's a need for it. So I do think it's worth a try. Thank you.
Thank you. I was telling somebody else in the chat that I was screaming and yelling and laughing at the same time for multiple points that you got to bring up in that conversation. So please, everybody, remember to use the Q&A. If you throw your questions into the chat, I will try to get to them and balance them out along the way. But we are officially in the Q&A portion of today's talk. I'll start with the first one that popped into the Q&A box of, have you found that using local language to name certain animals or beings will carry less of a strict gender binary than the westernized way of classifying species? So local languages, the languages of people, not necessarily, or local language as languages of people of specific geographic areas and or local names, not necessarily the scientific names that might get ascribed.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting question that I don't have a specific answer to, just because I am trained as an Americanist. As you probably noticed, I referenced a few British researchers, but this is not something that I have very specific expertise in. But I mean, speculatively speaking, well, let me say first that I, in my work, have tried really hard not to use scientific names for various animals, and have actually tried really hard to not read very much contemporary scientific literature about things, because I don't want to kind of reinscribe this sense that Western institutional science is the correct way to know things about animals. I am pretty sure that the kind of presupposition in this question that non-Western and maybe particularly non US and Western European kind of colonial scientific language around animals, I'm sure there would be a differently gendered outcome, because binary gender is in and of itself a colonial invention. But I don't have particular examples of what that would look like, just because that is out of my range, if you will. Or I don't have the range, I guess, would be the more accurate way to put it.
All good. Next one popped up in the chat, but I think there's a good point in kind of revisiting it. And it happened around the same time that you were talking about the idea of being biological anomaly, or acknowledging queer is acknowledging that there's a perceived normal. So how often does that come up in your? I feel like that's a massively long question to to ask, but how often does that come up, or how often do you find that you need to bring up those points in your talks or your presentations and in your work?
Can you rephrase the first part of that? How often do
you talk about or get at the idea that biological anomaly assumes that there is a biological normal?
Got it. Yeah, so the framing that I have, that is definitely part of it, right? Is kind of talking about how any effort to define a normal is like always going to exclude something else and pathologize it. I'm a lot more interested in my work at looking at the things that get pulled back into the normal. Basically what I try to do in the dissertation that I'm defending next week, so I guess this is good practice, is like show that what people tend to talk about as like cis binary sex actually has a whole lot of like management that has to happen. Like those, most people and most animals like do not actually fit into a binary framework. There is like a lot of rhetorical and practical scientific work that has to happen to make it look like things fit. And so I'm kind of looking at the process of how things get drawn back into the normal rather than excluded from it, because I think there's a fair amount of work that has kind of been done on you know, particularly if you're looking at like 19th century, early 20th century, like sexology of like the people who get like, you know, cast out of like heterosexual reproductive sex. I'm looking more at like, what are all of the people who get like declared normal, but if you actually look at the classification process, it totally falls apart. It doesn't make any sense at all to basically say like, oh, you all think that like trans people are like this like made up weird thing, but like actually cisness is totally incoherent when you actually get down to it.
Yes. So how was gender understood pre-colonial era binary, or what was kind of before the binary existed in the kind of colonial context?
It really, really depends on where you're talking about. So I don't want to like try to like gloss over like kind of individual instances, but like I would say that like the most places that were not like Western Europe and the US like had a much broader range of gender and sexuality options, essentially, often in the context or often people who were like not pathologized at all, but actually like had very specific kind of like sacred roles in certain places. And part of the process of colonization was to kind of clamp down on that and kind of try to force everyone into binary sex categories and kind of use that as evidence that like colonialism was like good. So like in the formation of the United States, for example, like there was a lot of you know, argumentation that because a lot of indigenous people in the Americas like had kinship, like what like colonizers called kinship structures that were like not didn't work in according with like Western legal structures, that meant that they can just like take people's land because it wasn't being like used responsibly and wasn't being like passed down family lines as people would put it. So it kind of was not just in terms of like gender and sexuality, but was also like really fueling the kind of material process of settler colonialism in a lot of places as well. Not sure if that like answers the question, but it's just like lots of things to that, like there is a very, very long answer to that question is basically what I'm saying.
It's a long history with a long answer.
Yeah.
Right. Before hopping into another more kind of like strict question, is the defense open next week?
It is not. It is not open. It will just be me and my committee. But thanks for, I guess, what is your interest in watching me sweat a lot?
It seems like a common practice for those to be open these days. So might be beyond scope, but it could fit. How does botanical science or the study of plants and fungi factor into notions and approaches to queering science? Are there possibilities that come directly from studying or thinking through plants and botany or fungi?
So I had a whole thing about that I wound up taking. I was going to put it in this talk and then I cut it because I was like, clearly already it was too long. But yes, so I have not done a ton of work on plants specifically. There are a bunch of my colleagues who have done that. But when I found a bunch of cool fungus stuff in a kind of different part of my project where I was looking at sex research at the like Cold Spring Harbor eugenics laboratories in the early 20th century. And one of the kind of like top researchers there, Albert Blakely, and his colleague, Sophia Satina, were doing a bunch of research on like fungus sex. And they wound up trying to figure out like, you know, they were clearly trying to identify like male and female fungi. They weren't like being flexible about that. But the way that they identified sex was truly bizarre. Because what they would do, like they had this specific kind of fungus they were working on. They would like grind it up, mix it with like different solvents and stuff, centrifuge it, and then they would conduct like different chemical tests on the like, you know, extract from these fungi, and would use that to determine what sex the fungus was. But I find that so interesting because so often we think about sex as like an anatomical thing, or like especially in like the early 20th century, you know, we tend to think about it in like pretty obvious like visual things that have something to do with the body. But in the instance of people studying, or at least these two researchers studying fungi, they were able to talk about sex without there being any bodies at all. Like it was totally removed from any kind of like embodied experience. It wasn't anatomical. They weren't like comparing things in terms of their like how they reproduced. It came down to like these very specific, you know, like how did this extract of the fungus like react in the presence of some other chemical kind of thing, which I just find absolutely fascinating, just in terms of like the changing meaning of like what sex is and where you find it. And at some point it becomes like so abstracted that you're like, what are you even talking about?
We'll have to bring you back for a separate talk on that, I think, at some point. I'm fixated on this now. That's a while.
I have a different talk already written on that I'm happy to do another time.
Sounds good to me. So we still have a couple of minutes left for Q&A, so I'll leave it open for now. But something that I could not help shaking during your talk, to kind of fill the Q&A void, was the idea that as soon as another possibility or another sex or gender appeared in any of these things, they kept trying to fit it into a different box instead of allowing a spectrum or like a set of possibilities to exist. And how often do you find that it's just another classification instead of creating a new understanding or a new system of fitting or a new kind of like knowledge system for fitting all this in?
Thinking about how I want to answer that because I have like 17 different thoughts. I guess my first thought is that, so what I talked about here is very much this kind of like whack-a-mole with like different forms of sex. There were other scientists in this moment, and you can even kind of get a sense of it in how people are talking about sex and race, where like they're trying to squish things into a binary at the same time that they're recognizing that it's way more complicated than that and recognizing that sex is a spectrum. So like I have another case study that instead of looking at animals, it's this, I like look at their like research materials of this gynecologist who is like making this argument that sex is on a spectrum. Most people are not kind of like at either end, or like, you know, have a mix of male and female characteristics. And this was like there was a kind of early 20th century moment where there was this theory called like universal bisexuality, which is different than like how we define bisexuality today. But it was this kind of like sex as a spectrum framework that got really popular for a while and then kind of declined. But anyway, the gynecologist who I write about, his name is Robert Leti Dickinson. He simultaneously, like, if you look at his like kind of theoretical writings about how he thinks sex works, he's like, oh, it's totally a spectrum. It is not simple at all. Like, look at me being so like, I'm a fancy scientist. Like, I have this like evolved understanding that like sex isn't just a binary. But then if you look at how he like actually treats his patients who have a wide variety of bodies, all of them are like strictly in a female category, and he never questions that at all. Or at least it like is not, if he was questioning that, he wasn't writing it down, and he wrote down a lot of stuff. So I'm really interested in this kind of like simultaneous existence of multiple frameworks of sex at the same time. Like historians kind of often kind of chart out a progression of like sex being defined in different ways at different moments, but I think it's actually a little bit more squished together and messy, where different people, and I mean this is still true today, I think, where like the same person can define sex in totally different ways, depending on like what they're trying to do with that definition.
Yes. Okay, so it doesn't look like there are any other questions rolling in. So we will wrap that up early. Thank you so much for that talk. And again, we'll have to bring you back for the fungi talk, which I'm very excited about. So thank you. And folks who attended and are still hanging around, this has been recorded, so we'll post this on the APS website and YouTube channel, along with it being circulated via the Science on Tap newsletter. So keep an eye out for that as we kind of move forward. Again, thank you for joining us for Science on Tap, which will be